Hello and welcome to Build and Thrive, the podcast that is dedicated to improving the health and the happiness of the construction industry. I am your host, Jennie Armstrong, and today I am back with a really exciting guest. So, Kevin Bampton from BOHS. If anyone hasn't heard of BOHS, it's the British Occupational Hygiene Society. I won't steal Kevin's thunder, and I'm sure he will tell you lots more about what BOHS does. But actually, on the podcast, we have spoken quite a lot about health risk management. We speak a lot about mental health, but actually looking at the physical health risks of what's involved within construction. This is something that we do at Construction Health and Wellbeing, and we regularly promote a prevention first approach. So today's conversation is talking about the principles of occupational hygiene. What does it actually mean and why is it important? We probably will get into future episodes where we'll dive into some of those key health risk topics. But for now, let's welcome Kevin to the podcast. Welcome, Kevin.
Good to see you, Jenny.
Thank you for being here. Can you just start off, just explain a little bit about who you are? And actually, I think probably helpful to explain who BOHS is as well. That would be great.
Okay, I'll start with BOHS. So, a very obscure naming organisation, the British Occupational Hygiene Society. And what that tells you is that we've been around for a long time, about 70 years. And it's started off really as a scientific body for doctors trying to understand what was making people ill at work. And it's grown out of that. So it's moved from just trying to understand what makes people ill to how do you stop people getting ill. And out of that, a whole profession has developed, which is the occupational hygiene profession. And we're the professional body for them. We host their standards body, but we're also a scientific body still. We do lots of research, we do campaigning, etc. And we live in the future. So we are worrying about not just what's happening today, but what's going to happen in 40 years' time. So we were predicting things that were going to be problems 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. So everybody's heard about the problems with asbestos. It was our organization that was trying to get people reducing the levels of exposure that were being experienced. So that's the organization. So within their history, I'm but a newcomer. I've been chief executive for 5 years. I'm not a health and safety specialist. I'm a public lawyer by trade. I've worked in all sorts of legal professions, etc. But I am definitely a passionate evangelist for the notion that you don't want to die from work. You don't get up in the morning and think, I just want to shorten my existence by going to work. That's not where we go for. So that's the starting point that I come from. I'm, as well as the chief executive of British Occupational Hygiene Society, I'm also the chair of a body called the Council for Work and Health. And that is the body that convenes all organizations, public organizations with an interest in health and work and represents their views to government. I have a slightly bigger brief.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. And I suppose probably for a lot of people listening, we talk about health and safety in construction and that principle you say about no one should be made ill by their work and the future of what that means. But so why do you think that when we talk about it from a health perspective, it's been so different to safety and why we've not seen the same traction as we have in the construction industry as we have over the last 20 years for safety?
So I think there's nothing particularly unusual about construction in focusing on the immediate. If you can see someone's about to fall off a ladder, that's an immediate thing that you worry about. If you can see that there's something that is going to be a problem, you can easily manage that. The difficulty about health is that even when something is happening to a body now, you can't necessarily see it. And when you're thinking about what might happen to someone in 10, 30, 40 years, that's pretty difficult to think about. And let's be honest, construction is about time. Of all of the work that I've ever done in construction, time is of the essence. So it's very much a lot of things are in the moment, and we tend to think about safety in the moment, whereas health really has to be managed a long way up the business process. And if you don't manage it early on, you're just basically counting the numbers at the end when you're trying to deal with health as something that you're trying to manage in the situation. So the problem for construction is that there is no other area of construction where you'd say, well, just turn up on site and then we'll think about, how many blocks do we need and how many litres of concrete do we need to pour, etc. You have to think ahead and plan and think about other stages. But unfortunately, health doesn't tend to get planned in early enough. So when it comes to the point of actually there being a real decision to make about health, it's often a bit too late, and the people on the ground can do limited amount around it. So they'll focus on safety because you can do something about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think from my experience, when you talk to construction firms about this principle that this workforce probably won't be your workforce in 10 years' time, but you've still got a duty of care to them to support the industry and for the ongoing health of them. But yes, until they see the impact of that it's often quite hard for them to tangibly understand why do we need to put so much focus on this. But things I did think are definitely getting better. I know in the last 10 years, I've definitely seen some more acknowledgement and understanding, but there is still a long way to go. Yeah.
And I think part of that, just to say, part of that comes from construction is beginning to move into the 21st century. We still do construction in a lot of places, a bit like we used to fight wars in the 19th century. Now, throw lots of people at it, dig a trench, but the number of people counts. And we're beginning to move to more modern methods of construction. And within that context, you start having more visibility about human health because the human factor within the business process becomes more important because it's not a question of numbers, it's even more a question of skills.
Yeah, absolutely. That we'll regularly talk about skills shortages and having enough people to do the work. So it is an essential part of what the industry needs to continue thriving and doing the best it can. So we've said that things from a safety perspective, statistically, we've seen things get better with fatalities, etc. When we talk about health risks and how health is managed in society and generally in work, how do you see the problem? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? What's your kind of knowledge around some of the statistics that we've seen?
Yeah, so some things we're seeing improvements, there's no doubt about it. But if you look at things like occupational asthma, which is often triggered by the use of specialist paint, specialist materials, that's increasing. If you take out the positive effect of banning smoking, and even if you ignore asbestos, the rate of interstitial lung disease, so that's disease is caused by occupational dusts by and large, those are going up, which is, no, so we're going almost in the opposite direction. So that in itself is a matter of concern. Um, we should be on top of things like noise and vibration, and we're not.
Mm.
So the things that we could do are not being effectively managed.
Yeah, and I think I put my kind of contractor hat on when I support organisations with their health risk management processes. I'll come to things like noise and vibrations. So it's a direct cause and reaction. We know what causes it. We know what happens. We can manage this. Sometimes things like how much dust you've inhaled, etc. It can be a little bit more variable, but some of the other kind of key health risks. Yeah, I'm with you that we should be able to be in a much better place to manage. In construction, things change on a daily basis and how they plan. One activity one day may be done in one way, change the weather, and it's a completely different impact. So yeah, I think things are definitely getting better, but there are still some obvious ones that perhaps we haven't seen the same traction with. I suppose one of the things that has resonated with me, and I've heard you speak about this before, Kevin, is actually the impact of the wider society and actually as the government perhaps, but equally as employers, the impact we can have not only benefits our business, looks after our people, but can benefit wider society. Do you want to just expand a little bit more on that and your reflections on it?
Yeah, it's very easy to think that managing health in construction is the right thing to do morally and it's a good thing to do. It's not nice for people to get ill and all of that kind of thing. But one of the stats that I explain to people to give them an idea about the impact of poor health management in construction is this. So construction contributes a huge amount to respiratory illness in this country. So there are about 40,000 cases of COPD each year that are created by the UK construction industry. And a good proportion of those will cross over with the number of respiratory cancers. So if we halved the number of respiratory cancers that are caused by current construction approaches, so just not managing dust, we could pay for all pediatric cancer. So every single child who has cancer, their treatment costs would be completely covered if we just halved the number of respiratory cancers caused by the construction industry. And we'll see people who do great things, or do sponsored runs for charity and all that kind of thing. And, we're not talking about a really difficult, expensive thing to do. This is about just good housekeeping. It's about good planning, etc. That is the scale of the cost of poor health management to the country. Just one example, you can roll it forward. So if you take the average age at which construction professionals cease to be able to work and be economically active, depends on your stats, but that's somewhere between 46 and 55, which means that when they're not economically active, they are economically dependent. So that means they're either receiving benefits, or they're working in a job where they have to have their income supplemented by benefits. Often they've got a disability, which they've acquired through work. And we only need to look at the news to see the expectations of people working another 20 years. You imagine that's 20 years worth of non-productive activity. That's bad for the individual. It's bad for their health, but it's absolutely disastrous for the nation's wealth. And that is another cost to construction. It's a direct economic cost that is caused by breaking people. But you know what? That's the reality. We get some growth benefit, but there is a growth cost, and much of the growth cost from construction is coming from poor management of health. So when people are deciding whether or not they should be putting extra focus into the health of their workforce in preventative measures, just bear in mind that at some point that those benefits have got to be paid for by someone. At some point, that cancer treatment's got to be paid for by someone, and that's going to come out of the profits of the business. So it's short-termist if you think that we can sustain this particular business model indefinitely.
That's, shocking. And if you needed a motivator for why we need to do more, then that is another one to add to the list of the many things that we realise why this is such an important topic. One of my frustrations, I often hear organisations talking about how do we attract people to the industry, and they put loads of emphasis on apprenticeship schemes, and absolutely there's a place for that. We need to encourage more people, but actually there's still that huge piece of work about how do we look after the people that we've already got, preventing them from getting ill health, but also putting my kind of occupational health nurse hat on, maintaining them to be able to be in the workplace and not just discarding them for someone that is probably 20 years younger and hasn't got the underlying health conditions that they've developed through working in the industry. Yeah.
And it's not impossible. Even 5 years ago when I started, there were construction firms that were saying, come and have a look at this process we're doing. No, we've got 55-year-old, 60-year-old women who are doing steel fabrication, because the way in which we do our construction, we've changed the business process. And that means that they're no longer needing to heft stuff across the muddy fields. They're no longer having to live away from home. And we're still delivering a high quality product, and we're still meeting the requirements of the customer. So it isn't about doing crazy, unexpected things. This is stuff that people actually do. Even in China, which you'd have thought, oh my goodness, China, they don't really care. Even in China, they value the construction workforce, and they look at ways in which they can use advanced methods to not only deliver a good product, but also to safeguard their workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And things are evolving with technology all the time. There should be a future where we can see that absolutely happening. I suppose, and I don't want to talk too much about politics, but do you think the government has got a part to play in how we address occupational hygiene and work related health? Do you think there's more that they could be doing to try and ensure that organisations are putting the time and the energy into focus on this?
Yeah, I think 5 years ago, even the health and safety executive at a corporate level were so far off the page. They hadn't really looked at the 100 deaths from health problems to one death from safety. You look at the HSE's strategy, now it's health prevention. So that's great. And governments commission people like Charlie Mayfield to review how to get people working, so they understand that construction is important. They understand they've got to develop construction workforce. At the moment, the dial is stuck at occupational health, and occupational health is a fantastic provision, but it is always no, it kicks in when someone's to become ill or when that risk is being actualized. So that the occupational health professionals call it no secondary prevention, because you've not stopped the person falling off the building. You're now running around with a mattress to make sure that when they hit the deck, they don't hit it too hard.
Mm.
And in safety terms, we wouldn't have mattresses as our first port of call. And the government still hasn't quite worked out that you need to roll back to where we were in the 70s and 80s, where there was a infrastructure to help business systematically to prevent them from getting people to get ill. I know that sounds like going back to the Stone Age, but the idea that any business could go along and get proper advice about how to manage their health risks. No, that shouldn't be future science. That just be the way things are. And at the moment, it's organisations like BOHS and occupational hygienists that people have to rely on. And there's only 700 occupational hygienists in the country. So we've got a lot of work to get around everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because we talk about the clinical side of occupational health, exactly what you've just said. And we regularly see now projects will have a nurse or an occupational health provider. There's still a long way to go. There's not everyone has easy access to that, but it's more of a kind of a regular occurrence. To find an occupational hygienist or one that's regularly working as an employed member of a construction firm, yeah, I can count on one hand how many employed hygienists that I've come across. And actually, all of them you speak to saying we could have had a team the same size as the safety team to be managing all of this and to keep on top of it. Yeah, definitely a lot further to go with the knowledge and the upskilling, and hopefully more occupational hygienists wanting to come into the construction industry as well. I presume, like with BOHS, this is one of your areas of trying to attract more people to the world of occupational hygiene as well.
Yeah, so there's an element about growth of the kind of the supply, but ultimately, no, it's a bit like occupational health. You could do health surveillance for everybody within an organization. That's very expensive and it's very personalized, etc. Or you could just eliminate that you're surveilling for, and then you don't have the cost. So you design out the risk. And I think the problem is often less about the availability of the hygienist or the occupational health professional, but where you put them in the mix. Because actually, by and large, in construction, you're not in a situation where you should need to be doing kind of regular measurements and stuff like that. No, you should have processes which are reliable and is designed to deliver healthy outcomes, because we're not, okay, some projects are really complex, but even the really complex projects, there's an element of rinse and repeat. Get the process and let the process take the strain. So I'm not trying to talk down the value of occupational hygienists, but I do want to make them redundant as well, because the
Yeah.
ideal thing is you just don't need to manage at the delivery end,
Yeah.
designing out the risk. And that's really the challenge, I think, for the construction industry, to do what it does so well, which is anticipate the problem, design out the problem, so you can get on and just build.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I'm going to put into the show notes for today's interview is the recent paper that BOHS wrote in response to the men's health strategy that came from the government. I think when some of the key bits that I pulled out from there was this whole principle of what we've been talking about, that there's lots in there about lifestyle and managing risk, but actually that principle of prevention and actually the workplace being a contributor to some of these health impacts was obviously hasn't come out as clear as it should in the strategy. Have you had any feedback on the paper that you've written, and any thoughts that might evolve that conversation any further?
Yeah, the number one response was from men saying, "What about women?" which I thought was absolutely fantastic. We did actually previously do a paper on the women's health crisis and the fact that there were even more women than men being made ill through work. But the government has come up with a men's health strategy, and that's brilliant, because actually gender does matter in terms of anyone who thinks gender doesn't matter or sex at birth doesn't matter in terms of your health outcomes probably is on another planet. The men's health strategy just forgot to mention that men work. And a good proportion of men do a reasonable amount of work. And so we couldn't provide a comprehensive answer to everything about every aspect of men's health. So we did pick a few examples. And construction's a classic example of where the public health messaging to men can say, don't drink too much, no, exercise regularly, no, have a healthy diet, avoid smoking, avoid stressful situations, get enough sleep. And then you look at the way in which construction is often delivered, and no, people are working odd shifts, they're working in noisy environments, they're possibly sleeping on very poor beds, they're probably having musculoskeletal problems because of the strain that they're putting on. That's meaning that they're not sleeping very well. Self-medication is a very likely outcome. People have a drink, etc., helps them get sleep, maybe take some tablets or something like that. They're often working away from home, so they don't have the social networks, which means more drink, more. No, they are doing a manual job, but that doesn't mean they fancy going out to the gym, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily getting exercise. And all of these things, the context in which we actually work within construction can be the drivers of these public health problems. And no, again, it's not about the impossible. I'm talking to construction companies who are saying, we recognize that actually it's the whole package in terms of how construction workers are living their lives that may mean that our business model is contributing not just to their ill health at work, but beyond work. And it is an interrelated thing. The idea. I've got a relative who's a welder, and no, he works out of the gym, but when he goes to work, it's hit or miss whether or not he gets any breathing apparatus, and he knows that his mates are going to have got sort of respiratory cancers, etc., and he's heading that way if he can't get out. So we have to understand that work is good for people in the right proportion, but there's a point at which work can actually be a negative influence. And what we want to do within construction, for selfish reasons, is to make sure that construction workforce is curated and valued for what it is, because British construction experts know, and this, both in terms of skills and trade, etc., some of the best in the world. And what we don't want to do is just break them and throw them away.
Yeah, I always have a kind of an analogy that I use about trying to treat construction workers almost like professional footballers or athletes, because actually there's so much that we could do to support them and make sure that they're being treated in the way that they should be. And one of those first principles, if they're given the right work, then we haven't got to do so much of the recovery and the rehab and the necessary kind of support that they need.
I mean, or even infantrymen. Now, when infantrymen were cannon fodder, they were the people who went in front of the people with horses and they ran at things, etc. The modern infantryman, no, isn't walking to war. And again, when you think about construction kills more of its workers through ill health by a factor of 10 than the Taliban managed to kill of our service personnel in a decade in Afghanistan. It's just
Yeah.
mind-blowing waste of personnel.
Yeah, that's definitely a shocking statistic. That if anyone's going to take anything from today, is to factor that into actually there is a huge opportunity here for what benefit we could bring by even improving things by 10%. I'm sure we'll see some traction in that.
I mean, if there was a stat, I'd say take home and tell your managers is we did a piece of number crunching earlier on this year, just taking the data from the Labour Force survey about construction and ill health, not just long-term ill health, but actually short-term ill health. And what would that add to the cost of a project? So if you carry on normal, not bad, not the worst, but just normal construction methods based on current stats in terms of health problems caused by the construction workplace, you need to add 15% labour costs on top of anything that you factor in terms of delivery. 15%. So that's the cost of the labour that is being lost because we're not managing health in the workplace. So that's either 15% off the bottom line or 15% onto the quote. And
Mm-hmm.
it no, people wonder why do labour costs overrun? Actually, part of it is because you're destroying the capacity, and it's not in a predictable way. When you cost out a building job, you can cost out the attrition and waste. You might no, you're overspray in terms of concrete or whatever, and you can predict that and you can build that in. But you don't know whether it's going to be Bob at the critical point of delivery who's going to be ill, or you don't know whether it's Maisie at the sharp end of making a decision. It's a random bullet that you're setting yourself, and 15% is extraordinary.
Yeah.
When I did the maths again, because I'd talk about it, I thought that's just mind blowing. How much profit you could share the profit, get the job done. And the thing is, that's not factoring in the delay factor, because we all know when the critical people are not available, it delays things, and delay is cost. It's everything goes to pot.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Quantify what that actually means in financial terms. 15% for any of the construction firms listening to this. It's do the sums, invest a small amount of that into trying this into the prevention piece, and then you might see some longer term benefits. Yeah, that's scary. And I think it just shows the value of what BOHS are trying to do to raise the profile of this as a topic. And as I said, I'm definitely seeing some improvements in construction. The big jobs, HS2, size where they're talking about this stuff really early on, which actually, again, in my time in the industry, it was the afterthought. Design was never a
Yeah.
topic of conversation, but I think we're still just lacking lots of those tangible things, like what does this actually mean in practice? And we're still firefighting. The construction started. What do we see here and now? How do we manage this as it's happened? When actually we take the step back and say, actually, what could we learn from that to make sure we prevent it next time? As I said, improvements happening, but not near where we need to be just yet. So one of the things that particularly that I do within construction health and wellbeing is as I work closely with health and safety managers, and actually a lot of the people that listen to this are in the health and safety profession. I'm always of the kind of mindset with health and safety is that actually there's a lot of health and safety managers that do understand the principles of occupational hygiene and understand and can apply it well in their work. But I think there's still a huge proportion that would put their hand up and say, I am a safety professional, not a health and safety professional. I suppose if you were to give any kind of thoughts or advice to anyone working in health and safety, is there anything that you would support them or advise them to do to help them get that knowledge and skills and to try and be applying more health-like safety type approach?
Yeah, the starting point is that look at your job title, and if the word health is in your job title, then think, as I'm wandering around the day, what proportion of my day is actually about health and what proportion of my day is about safety. And the demands will be primarily on safety. But if you're not even thinking about it, then you're obviously missing a proportion of that's easier said than done, but just a little reminder. So starting point is you are a health and safety profession. And the problem with the health bit is that fewer people are going to shout out about the health. And that means that you remembering it is probably, on a platform, on a site, you're probably the person who's going to be thinking about it first. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be the expert. You don't need to be expert, because actually the things that cause problems for health on a construction site, by and large, are relatively limited in scope. We're not talking about working in a really complex pharmaceutical factory with weird and wonderful biological agents. No, you're talking about musculoskeletal disorders, you're talking about noise and vibration, you're talking about dust. No, those are the principal things. And actually, most of them, again, are observables. No, the damage is hard to observe, but I get dragged onto the construction sites, which I find very interesting. But I've been on sort of high security construction sites where the broom's been banned forever, where you have airport style security and your bags are checked, and you'll see a sort of 2 meter yard broom parked there. I've been onto high tech sites where you can see someone with a crowbar trying to move a piece of rebar into place, etc. These are all observable things. The human body wasn't designed to work with steel crowbars, etc. If you see someone doing something manually, if there's a machine that's making a hole in a concrete wall and the other side of the machine is a bloke, look, if you bash the bloke against the concrete wall would win. So, mediated by a piece of electronics, is not going to. So, look for the obvious, because actually the gross risk is in the obvious, and it's the same thing with dust. No, it doesn't take a lot to be able to identify when you're generating dust. You can hear noise, and the real starting point is not the micro risks, the stuff that you get a hygienist. If you've got to bring someone in to measure, are we too loud because it's a bit noisy here? You probably already know that there's a problem. And there's a temptation to say, how much is low enough? What can I get away with? And if you think that a component of dust is respirable crystalline silica, that's a carcinogen. So the law says reduce as low as reasonably practicable. So get rid. And if you want to see what not getting rid looks like, you look at the 23-year-old guy who's just been referred for a lung transplant after working 18 months with RCS. So there's an element to it's bleeding obvious. And that, for health and safety professionals, actually, it's sometimes easier to point to a sign or point to a safety default, and harder to say to a bunch of people who are just ignoring everything and wearing dust masks on their head, etc. It's easier to have the conversation about the safety risk than it is the health risk, because actually often you're pushing against process. It's badly designed process and time, that people are cutting corners, they're picking up the manual tool because they've got to do something quickly. So that's where I would go. There's a construction health risks course that you can do, which can give you more detail about it. But at heart, the big risks, the things that people can do, are being brave enough to say, I don't care whether or not it's a rush. There's too much dust there. We need to no more work until the dust's been sorted out. Get rid of that hand tool. What the hell's a broom doing there? Go and get yourself a vacuum cleaner. It'll make them even more unpopular than they already are.
Yeah.
But your mum was never popular with you when she was saying no to brush your teeth. But boy, when you're a bit older, you kind of value having it in ashes.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I related to some of my experience working with contractors and saying to them, like if someone was working at heights, they weren't clipped on, you would stop work. It's an immediate risk. You've got to get in that same thought process with managing. People are breathing in too much dust. It's not just an acceptance. Yes, construction, we know it's dusty and we know it's noisy. It's exactly the same principles. How do you say this is not safe? No one should be going into work. And that is the role of the health and safety professional, is to make sure they intervene when things can cause harm. So yeah, it's that maybe their confidence in the topic, I think sometimes, is they maybe don't trust their own thought processes, but equally they get challenged back to say, oh, this is construction, it's noisy, it's dusty, we just got to continue on, we've got to get the job done, we can't stop for a bit of dust.
And I think that there is a difficulty. I think one of the things that we don't perhaps capitalize on enough is that often the operator says it's my risk, and
Mm,
explaining secondary exposure is it's a posh way of saying it's a bit like passive smoking. No, there was a time when it was a bit, if you were smoking, you'd say it's my choice, it's my lungs. Everybody understands that it's not just their lungs, that they're compromising other people. And for principally for things like noise and dust, you are actually compromising other people.
mm,
And for vibration, there's very little vibration that doesn't happen without noise. So I think there is an element of saying, even if you want to wreck your health, no, the people around you have no control over that, and you're giving people a good chance of cancer in the same way as if you were smoking.
yeah. Definitely some really interesting reflections there, and I'm sure giving people some things to think about. There's probably loads we could talk about, Kevin, and I'm keen that perhaps in the future we bring you back on and talk about some other specific areas. I suppose my final kind of question to you, and anything you want to reflect on, is if there's one key thing that you would like a construction company or someone working in construction to take away. Is there anything that you think there's key bits of advice that you'd like them to leave with after today's interview?
Yeah, so I spoke at Hinkley Point a few years ago, and then they invited me back, despite the fact I said shocking things, to talk to the CEOs of their supply company. And at the end of it, a guy came up to me, shook my hand, and he'd been taking notes, and it was Ray O'Rourke from Lang O'Rourke, and he said, "No, we really do need to do something about it." Now, I think Ray O'Rourke could be classed as being relatively successful in the construction industry and also relatively experienced. And if Ray can, and he is continuing, if someone like Lang O'Rourke can see that you can make good business and you can do a better job and you can deliver high quality construction while looking after the health of people, then I don't think anyone else can argue that it's possible. But I think it's like anything else. You have to think about building the health of your workforce like any other part of construction. You need to plan, you need to budget, and you need to see that it's not that nothing is a cost of. Yeah, it's nothing is a cost to. It's an investment. You invest early, you plan early, you design out the risk, you let the process take the strain, you reap the profits, you are more successful, and you build better buildings.
Absolutely. I'm going to steal that, Kevin. Definitely the investment piece rather than it's a cost. And yeah, especially with the stats that you shared about the 15% cost that it can incur by just, not managing this. So I think there's lots to take away. Thank you, Kevin. If people want to get a hold of you or get a hold of BOHS, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, so it's bohs.org, and always happy to have messages from people. So kevin.bampton at bohs.org. And we've got a massive free resource in Breathe Freely in Construction, which you helped with. And there's lots
Yes.
and lots of free advice for construction there on how to manage particularly respiratory risk.
Yes. No, thank you, Kevin. I know that, so we probably built we're getting on nearly 10 years ago. I think it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, but I still regularly use it. My favourite one is the COSH assessment tool, helping organisations understand how to do a proper COSH assessment. So yeah, I will make sure we link to the Breathe Freely resources as well. So thank you, Kevin. I appreciate your time. And yeah, hopefully we'll have you back on for next series.
Thanks for having me, and carry on the good work.
Thanks, Kevin.